Hello and welcome to Rach Aquarelle. In today's tutorial, we will be painting this beautiful, tranquil mountain lake scene. And these are the specific colors that I use, so you might want to pause here if you'd like to take note of these. But it's important to know that you do not need to use the specific colors that I use in order to follow along with this tutorial, and I will be referring to my colors just as warm and cool, just for simplicity's sake. And I do have a template available. There's a link for that in the description below if you would like to use this to transfer onto your watercolor paper. If you don't have a light box, I recommend getting some carbon paper. It's very inexpensive, it's very crinkly, and it's very easy to use. The watercolor paper that I use is Fabriano, and this is a cold press, 140-pound paper. And anything that I use is just a personal recommendation, but you can use whatever materials you have handy or whatever fits your preferences. I have a few brushes of various sizes, though I doubt that I will use all of them for this painting, but I like to have them handy, just in case. And now I will go over, in a very simple way, the colors that I will likely use for this painting. So first is my cool blue, which is my ultramarine, my warm blue, which is a phthalo blue. I have an extra lemon yellow for mixing greens, a cool red or permanent rose, a cool yellow, which is a lemon yellow, and a warm yellow, which is new gamboge. And I also will be using my warm red, which is called Scarlet Lake. So I'm just gonna try to get things set up as I go along. Of course, you're going to need a glass or cup of water handy, as we are watercolor painting. I like to use a little dropper just to get my dried up watercolor paints reactivated, because of course they dry, which is actually kind of a nice thing about watercolors, is that they can dry and you can just keep using them. For this painting, I will be using a little bit of masking fluid, and this is optional. And it's a good idea to gently shake it if you start noticing that it's settling. An important thing to know about masking fluid is that you should never, ever use one of your painting brushes to apply masking fluid. You can see that the masking fluid that I've used with that toothbrush has just completely destroyed the bristles. I also like to use these silicone applicators to apply masking fluid, though I don't think I'll use that for this painting. Of course, we're going to need a couple of paper towels by our side. Alright, I'm going to try to get everything set up here the way that I like. And I have a board that I will fasten my watercolor paper onto. And I always use painter's tape, just from the hardware store, to fix my watercolor paper down to my board. And my paper will still buckle, but keeping it taped down does help. And nothing else, it gives us that nice white, clean edge when we're done, and I really like that. So I'm gonna just carefully tape down each side of the paper, being careful not to waste too much tape. And the reason that I use painter's tape, which doesn't refer to art painting, it refers to painting the walls of your house. But it's nice because it is a little bit less adhesive than typical masking tape. There is such a thing as artist's tape. I've never used it. I imagine it's maybe a little bit more pricey. And to be honest, I've never had any issue with the painter's tape, so I usually buy it in bulk because I go through it really fast, if you can imagine. Alright, so now I'm going to place my template on top of my watercolor paper. And since there is a very straight horizon line, or at least that line where the lake and the mountains meet, I want to be pretty careful and make sure that I line things up so that that line is perfectly horizontal. And I'm just using 2 pieces of tape to hold it in place so I don't have to worry about it moving while I'm doing my transfer. So here is my handy dandy carbon paper once again. And what you'll want to do is place it with the dark side facing your watercolor paper, between your watercolor paper and your template. And now, this is where you need to experiment just a little. And if you would like to use a ruler to do this straight line, I would actually recommend that. But on some of these lines, especially in the mountains and in the water, we want to be careful to not apply too much pressure because those areas are going to be very light in value in our painting. And so I'm just going to double check some of those to make sure that, first of all, I'm not applying too much pressure. For example, these most distant mountains are going to be the lightest. So I don't want the transfer lines to be too dark, and I know you probably can't see much of anything at all, but I don't want those lines to be too dark, but I also want them to be dark enough that I can at least somewhat see them, so I don't forget all about them once I start applying washes. So it's a good idea just to very lightly trace and then check it to see if it is dark enough, and I would recommend to err on the side of not applying enough pressure. Now, you can erase the carbon paper lines, but of course if you can just avoid that altogether, that would be optimal. So always start out with a very light pressure, and then if you check it and you feel like it's not quite dark enough, you'll at least have a good sense of how much more pressure you need to apply. Okay, so I know you can see some lines on some of the mountains and hills that are more in the mid-ground. I don't need to worry about those lines being too dark because I'm going to be applying some pretty dark values of paint to those areas. I really want to just be careful in those most distant mountains and in the water. Alright, so now I have my template transferred onto my watercolor paper. And I think that one of the benefits of having a template available is that if you start your painting and something doesn't go quite right, you can easily start another painting, and you don't have to worry about figuring out that entire drawing again. So using the template just makes that part of the process a little bit easier. And for any tutorial that I do that involves much drawing, I will always provide a template available to you. So the first thing that I'm going to do is my masking fluid technique. I always have a little bit of trouble with the lid. And I like to just pour a little bit of masking fluid into a container. And always remember to put the lid right back on your masking fluid, because being exposed to oxygen causes it to dry rapidly. Alright, so I'm going to use a couple of paper towels to guard portions of my painting that I don't want masking fluid to get onto, because I'm going to use a splatter technique with another toothbrush. So I've got a toothbrush that I haven't yet ruined. This was one of those cheapos that you get at the dentist for free. Well, I mean, I guess it's not really free because you're paying the dentist. And it's really important to remember that the masking fluid absolutely must dry entirely. And I'm cutting out of the video all the time that I spend letting things dry. But you can kind of see some of those spatters, I hope. And if you flick masking fluid onto your painting in spots that you don't want it, be very mindful to still let it dry before you rub it off, because if you try to rub the masking fluid off while it's wet, you'll actually press it down into the fibers of the paper. Okay, so I've waited about 5 minutes here, and I'm using my fingers to check to make sure all of the masking fluid is dry. When you spatter it, it does dry pretty quickly. It'll feel a little bit tacky, but you'll know that it's dry because it won't come off on your fingers. You can also usually tell if you have a masking fluid that turns yellow when it's dry, like I do. And there's other masking fluids that turn different colors when they dry to help you find out when yours is dry. I'm going to be applying a wash, very light, to the sky area. So I'm going to start out with just getting my paper wet in the sky area. I'm not really avoiding the mountains at all because this is going to be a very light wash. So it's not going to matter if some of that gets into the mountain areas. In fact, that's actually very desirable because I want some nice soft edges. I'm starting off with my cool blue and my warm red. You see here I've got a nice violet. And I'm going to add just a touch of yellow just to gray it down a little bit. And anytime that you see my brush go off camera, I'm most likely dipping it into my glass of water. So we're just going to apply this wash all over the sky. Again, we don't need to be careful about those mountains at all. In fact, you could even just paint the entire top half of this painting with this wash if you want, if you have a large enough brush. My brush isn't quite large enough to make that easy. Alright, so while that is still wet, I'm going in with essentially the same mix, except it's a little bit more blue this time, and it's also just a little bit more concentrated, so it should be a little bit darker. And typically I like to paint skies so that they are a little bit more saturated or darker at the top, and then as they come down to the horizon, they get a little bit lighter. I'm also going to apply well, I wouldn't call this a wash, but I'm just kind of roughly applying this color down into the water area. And I did not wet this area first because I actually want my brush to drag along that rough surface and leave a few areas of white. So you can see I'm letting the brush kind of skip around. And it's important to remember with watercolors that they always dry a little bit lighter in value than when you first apply them. So this area in the water that I applied that wash is actually going to be one of the lightest areas in this painting. And while your sky is still wet, you can continue to add color as desired, but just don't overdo it. And before we move on, we do want to let this dry. And since I cut out all the drying time, I'll just let you know when it's time to take a little break. So now I'm using both my cool blue and my warm blue, and I'm going into my warm red again. So I'm getting a little bit more complex violet here. And I'm going to start making note of some of these mountains. And I'm going to start with the darker mountains. For now, I'll wait on the most distant mountains. And right from the offset, I want to incorporate some dry brush into these mountains, which is why I wiped my brush off on my paper towel, because these mountains up front will have a lot more texture in them. So now I'm just very lightly marking the more distant mountains. And remember that watercolor does dry a little bit lighter. So I want those distant mountains just to be about one shade darker than the sky, because I want them to fade into the distance. And as I move to the mountains that are closer, I can use paint that is more pigmented. And I'll also continue to use dry brush techniques. So I'm replenishing my warm blue, my warm red, and that warm red is a very strong pigment, so I try to just add a little bit at a time so I don't take it too far in that direction. And I'm just making this mountain a little bit darker. I didn't quite get as dark as I really needed to on the first pass. And I'm also going to try to remember to put marks into the water to help give the impression of a reflection. So every time I apply color to the mountain, I'm going to try to apply a few strokes of that same color into the water. And one thing I want to make a note of really quick is that line right between the water and the mountains. Try to remember to leave a little bit of a space there, so leave it white if you can remember, because that helps it just have a little bit more of a natural look. So my transfer lines were so light that I actually forgot about the most distant large mountain. So I went ahead and I just added that, and I needed it to be slightly lighter value than the hillside in front of it. And going ahead, getting more blues, getting more of my warm red, and going to use a little bit more hard edges to define some of these hillsides or mountains that are a little bit closer to us. Wiping it off whenever I need my bristles to be a little bit drier to achieve texture. And of course, just adding that color into the water. You'll notice that I don't take that all the way up to the shoreline. More of my warm blue, and now my warm yellow to get a nice warm green, but it's just a little too green, so to gray it down I'm adding some of my cool red. I really like this color. Every time I mix this particular color I just really like it, so it's my warm blue, warm yellow, and cool red. And typically when I'm mixing neutrals or grays, I will not use all warm colors. I won't use all cool colors. I'll kind of mix it up. So this hillside that is in front of all the others, I want it to be just a little bit more green. I didn't want it to be bright green because it's still quite a ways in the distance from where we're viewing it, if we want to imagine that we are sitting at this lake painting it. So we're going to get a little bit of atmosphere to kind of mute the greens that we see. And again, just applying that into the water, leaving just that very thin little space. If you feel like you are going to need a reminder to leave that little space, you might actually want to apply a very thin line of masking fluid right there. I probably would have done that, but I just didn't think about it. Alright, so I'm mixing up more of that nice warm green, then throwing in a bit of my cool red. There's quite a bit more yellow in it this time, but it won't make too much of a difference, because I had just forgotten to apply that into the water when I did that hillside over on the left. Alright, so I'm going to just wash my brush off, let things dry just a little bit, maybe. And I'm going to just pick this up just to kind of show you. You can tell areas that are really wet because you'll get just a little bit of glare or shine when you move it around. But also don't assume that just because you don't see that things are completely dry, because even if it is damp, you may not see that glare. The best way to tell is to lightly touch. And one strategy that I recommend is that you work on your painting in a way that you can allow one part to dry while you work on another part. And then by the time your first part is dry, you can get back to working on that and allow the second part to dry. So right now I'm using a glaze because the paint that I'm applying this on top of is completely dry, and I'm allowing this paint to be very light and transparent. So this is just basically my warm blue, and I'm applying it pretty uniformly all over the water because I want to start giving it a blue tint, but I don't want it to be too dark, especially on the area of the reflection that is reflecting the sky, so it's very light. And again, you can just see how wet that is and how light I applied that glaze. And what I love about glazing is that it starts to bring together everything that we put underneath. So I've grabbed my smaller brush. This is not my smallest brush. In fact, I could use a bigger brush, but this is a round brush, and so I'm going to have a little bit more control over this. And I'm also going to not want that brush to be very wet. And what I'm doing is I'm applying just a little bit more pigment to these most distant mountains. I don't want to overdo it, and I primarily want to apply pigment to the valleys or the low points of those slopes, because as those slopes descend, you get a little bit more shadow, so sometimes you'll have just a little bit more value, a little darker value at the base of the mountains. Then I just added some of my cool yellow and my blue to get a nice muted bluish green. And I'm starting to try to redefine these slopes in front. And this isn't something that you need to be terribly careful about. I just basically want to add some value and texture variations in here so that everything looks natural. A little bit more cool blue and my cool red. And you see that that gives me a really vibrant violet. And then when I add yellow, it tones it down just a little bit because violet and yellow are complements of each other. And now I'm just going back into these, especially this most distant large slope has a lot of rough cliffs. So I want to help bring out a little bit of that texture. With a little bit of dry brush technique. And you, at this point, can probably see that some of the masking fluid that I spattered is on that large mountain, and that's okay. Oh, and you know, I just realized I didn't explain why I applied that spattering of masking fluid. So I decided that for this scene, I didn't want everything to be too smooth or uniform. I didn't really want just like a sky with a smooth gradient. And so I decided I would try to make the sky a little bit foggy and gray. And I thought one interesting thing to do might be just to add a kind of random spattering of masking fluid just to give a little bit of interesting texture in the sky. So it's not snow, it's not rain. And we'll just see how it looks because I actually have not had that idea before to do that in the sky. Sometimes I think I paint too literally, and I have to make an effort to kind of loosen things up and be a little bit more spontaneous. So this color that I am using right now is primarily that warm yellow with, I think it's primarily just my cool blue, my ultramarine blue. And I'm just going in and glazing on top of those closest slopes to help them be just a little bit more green. And then I added my warm blue in there, and I'm going in with some really bold gestures and scumbling, especially as that slope gets nearer to the water. And I'm just testing to make sure that the water is dry enough to apply my next glaze, and I think that it is. So this time I'm going to go in very bold with lots of my warm blue, my phthalo blue. I want to add just a little bit of my cool yellow to that so it's not overwhelmingly blue. And instead of applying this all over, I'm applying this glaze only to the reflections of the mountains. And along the edges, you can see I'm kind of using a zigzag motion so that I don't get lines that are too straight. And you can see that all the marks in the dry brush that we applied to the water to begin with helps to create the impression of some of the texture from the mountains and hills actually vaguely showing up in the water reflection. And I'm applying even more pigment closer to the shoreline because the reflection there will be a little bit stronger, and as it moves away from the hills it's going to dissipate a little bit. Glazing is honestly one of my favorite things to do. I just absolutely never get over the seemingly complex effects that you can get from just being patient and doing a little bit of glazing. So while this is all still wet, I'm just applying a very little bit of lemon yellow to the lighter areas of the reflection. And this is totally optional. Sometimes I just like to kind of throw in random colors again because I kind of just have to make an effort to make things a little bit spontaneous. So sometimes I'll just get an idea in my head and I'll just go for it. And at this point we've really come along. I'm also using a little bit more of that lemon yellow, that cool yellow, to emphasize some of the greener areas on these hills. And of course we'll want to let that dry before we move on, because we have quite a bit of this painting now that is very wet. So while we're waiting for things to dry, I am just going to clean up my mixing palette a little bit. I try to keep all of my mixes on camera, so if that area gets a little bit too polluted, then I just use a paper towel to wipe it off. And one of the nice things about a ceramic palette is that they're so easy to clean. They don't stain quite like plastic palettes do, so I recommend them. Now, I am a bit accident prone, so I'm a little nervous every time I use it, and I certainly don't travel with it, but it also just feels really nice to mix on a ceramic palette. So I'm using some dry brush with my warm yellow, and I'm applying that to some of the mountains that are looking really violet. Again, yellow is a complement of violet, so by glazing that or using a dry brush over the violet colors, I can kind of tone that down a little bit and also warm up the temperature. So I'm using a really bold green with a little bit of red mixed in to tone it down, to really start defining the slopes and the shrubbery, trees, everything that is growing on this slope. Oops, that was a little too much red. Anyway, I'm going to be very bold and use lots of pigment and some dry brush techniques to get some texture. I don't want to overdo it, but right at the shoreline we should be seeing quite a lot of texture, a lot of dark values. And again, going back into these distant cliffs, I don't want to overdo the texture, but I also don't want it to be too soft. So it's a balance. And if you ever feel like you have overdone it somewhere, I would just recommend being patient, because if you take your eyes off that spot where you think you might have overdone it, kind of get it out of your mind for a little bit, you might look back at it once it's dry and realize that you actually didn't go too far, because remember, watercolor always dries a little bit lighter, fortunately. It makes it a little bit tricky to kind of judge how you're applying things, especially if you're trying to get a really dark value, but I think overall it's a quality of watercolor that I really like. And again, the areas that are closer to the valleys of these mountains are going to have a little bit more pigment, a little bit more darker values, just because they are receding a little bit, and so they're going to have more shadow, they're going to have less atmosphere affecting them. So I'm going to go back in with a little bit more of that lemon yellow to help bring out some of the greens, some of the highlights in the closest hillsides. So I'm just kind of glazing that over areas where the values are a little bit lighter. And those areas actually are pretty well dry. And you'll find that there's less and less time that you have to spend waiting for things to dry as your painting progresses, because in watercolor, since we start with our lightest values and work darker, that means we are using less water in our mixes as we go, so things will just dry faster for us. And I'm also adding just a little bit of yellow to that most distant mountain, just to help define it a little bit more without actually taking the value down a notch. So it's still very light in value, but you can see that it's really clear that it's actually back there. So now I'm going back into my cool blue. Again, we're going to be getting into our darker values, bolder colors, so we'll be using a lot more pigment and a lot less water. So I've mixed my cool blue, a red, a yellow, and I want to start defining areas within the reflection that are just a little bit darker. So just right along the shoreline. Again, I'm still maintaining that bit of white between the water and mountains. And just know that you don't have to keep that perfectly straight. In fact, if you keep it too straight and perfect, it's not going to look natural. So as long as it's there a little bit, it doesn't matter if you accidentally apply a little bit of paint on it. In fact, it's a little bit to your benefit to have those kinds of things happen. And I may end up doing another pass of color right here, but while it's wet, I want to let it dry before I apply any more paint on top, because if you go over your wet surface with your brush, you actually can end up picking up more pigment than you're applying. So let things dry, especially as you are working in your darker values, because those pigments need to be completely absorbed into your paper. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue applying some glazes to the hillsides, really bringing out some of those shadowy areas and texture. And there's no right or wrong way to do this. It's kind of just however you feel. You can have mountains and hillsides that are a little bit smoother or even rougher than what I do, but just use your judgment. And we're just kind of waiting for things to dry. And I'm going to kind of test to make sure that the sky is really bone dry, and it should be, because we haven't done a lot to the sky area since that very first wash that we applied at the beginning of the painting process. Now I'm using my finger to gently remove the speckles of masking fluid, and one thing I want to caution you about is that if your paper is even slightly damp and you try to remove the masking fluid, that masking fluid, which has binded itself onto your paper, but your paper is wet, so you risk rubbing off your actual paper fibers if your paper is even the least bit wet. So in general, I would even say to let your painting sit for a couple of hours before you remove masking fluid, just so that you can be sure. But I knew that my sky would be quite dry, so I went for it. So you can now kind of see the nice speckled, spattered texture that I have in the sky. It's very spontaneous. I think it actually looks pretty good, so not bad for the first time trying out that idea. And I really like how some of it got onto the mountain. Although I think what I'm going to do is use a little bit of paint to go over some of those speckles that are on the mountain. It won't make them go away, but it'll help them not to be so starkly white. Of course, if that did bother me, I could just use some pigment to go over those speckles and basically make it look almost as though they never existed. So that's really up to you. I'm just going to go in with a very light dry brush with blue. Don't need to remix the exact colors that I used on this mountain. Because it's in the distance, I'm pretty safe just going with blue. Because objects further in the distance usually are a little bit cooler in temperature. So you can see that I kind of softened those speckles, but they're still visible. They still left some texture, and I really like that. And at this point, we are just so close to being finished with this painting. I have to admit, I am fiddling just a little bit. I tend to do that. I try not to. I think that I've gotten a little bit better about not overworking my paintings, but I think it's just going to be a constant struggle. So I'm using my cool blue, my cool red, a little bit of yellow to tone it down. And there was just a little bit in the sky where I felt like the masking fluid was a little bit too concentrated for me. So I'm going over it very lightly. I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to change the color of the sky. So it's still kind of there, but I'm not going to worry about it. I need to let it dry, of course. And while I'm letting the painting dry, just kind of clean things up on the palette. When I am finished painting, I really try hard to clean up my area, clean up all my equipment. I think it's just a good habit to develop. It helps me to kind of symbolically tell myself that the painting is done, so inevitably when I look at my painting a few minutes later and I decide, oh, there's just one more thing I need to do, and then it ends up being 10 more things. So if I take the time to make myself stop and actually clean up, I'm less likely then to overwork a painting, because especially kind of cleaning up the spills in my paint wells is a little bit of a challenge, because sometimes instead of wiping up a color, I just end up smudging it all over the place, and I get kind of frustrated with that, but that's okay. I do like things to be somewhat neat. Can never be perfect. But I like to just get things cleaned up to the best of my ability, again, because it helps me acknowledge that I'm finished. And also when I come back the next day to paint, I get to come back to a nice, clean space. And that feels better than coming into a messy space, in my opinion. Now, that's not to say that I'm very neat or organized in general. There's just certain things that I do like to wrap up when I'm done. So now I get to do my favorite part and remove the painter's tape. You'll notice that I always pull away from my painting. I never pull straight up, and never ever do I pull inward. I've never had a painting tear while using this kind of tape. I've had paintings tear using regular masking tape, but still, I would advise everyone to err on the side of caution. Pull away from your painting so that if any ripping occurs, hopefully it just occurs on that white edge around your painting. Alright, so I'm going to give you a close-up. I just love that texture created by the masking fluid. Just adds a little bit of uniqueness and interest to the painting, so I hope that you gave that a try if you decided to. And I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. And I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. And I think that's it. So one last thing I wanted to show you was what happens to the masking fluid when it dries in my dish. So you can see, you can just kind of grab it and pull it out. It's a little bit like rubber cement. Kind of funny. And so it's really easy to clean up if you put it into a glass or ceramic bowl. Thank you guys so much. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment. I am on Instagram as Rach Aquarelle.